Language is more than words. It is memory, thought, and identity, all woven into one. Every civilization has shaped its reality through the languages it spoke, the scripts it carved, the words it passed down. But what if I told you that not all languages died naturally? What if some were deliberately erased, not because they were useless, but because they contained truths too dangerous to survive? We grow up believing that history is a long, inevitable chain. Languages evolve, some flourish, others disappear. Latin gives way to French and Italian. Ancient Egyptian morphs into Coptic. Old English becomes modern. It all feels like a natural, organic process. But scattered throughout human history are strange gaps. Scripts that were once widely used and then suddenly silenced. Cut off not just from everyday speech, but from human memory itself. Take the Etruscan language, spoken across Italy long before the rise of Rome. The Etruscans built cities, temples, and advanced systems of trade. Their culture influenced Roman religion, architecture, even political symbols. And yet, their language is almost completely lost. Thousands of inscriptions survive, carved into stone, etched into metal, written on linen. We can see the words, we can copy them, but we cannot read them. Modern linguists call Etruscan a mystery language, with only fragments deciphered. How does a civilization so central to Rome's foundation vanish linguistically, while everything else it built was absorbed? Or consider Linear A, the script of the Minoan civilization on Crete. Their palaces were vast, their trade networks sprawling, their art exquisite. But their writing remains a closed door. Despite decades of study, no one has cracked it. Scholars compare it to Linear B, which was deciphered in the 1950s, but Linear A resists every key. If language is a code to understanding culture, then the Minoans remain a ghost people, forever locked behind untranslatable symbols. Then there are the Maya glyphs, found on pyramids, stelae, and codices. For centuries, scholars could not read them. Whole histories of kings and wars, astronomy and prophecy lay in plain sight but inaccessible. Only in the late 20th century did progress come, and even now, much remains unread. Entire codices were burned by Spanish priests who saw them as demonic, knowledge incinerated deliberately. The pattern grows stranger still when you realize how often languages vanish at turning points in human history. The fall of an empire, the rise of a new faith, the conquest of a people. Each time, languages vanish not like flickering candles, but like lights abruptly switched off, leaving only traces of what once illuminated entire civilizations. What if this isn't a coincidence? What if erasing a language was never about natural decay, but about control? Because here's the unsettling truth. If you erase a language, you don't just silence a people. You erase the way they understood the world, the knowledge encoded in their words, the concepts that only their vocabulary could hold, disappear with it. Think of it this way. What if Etruscan contained ideas about the human spirit that Rome found dangerous? What if Linear A preserved instructions, not myths but technologies, rituals, or even sciences that later powers wanted hidden? What if Mayan glyphs recorded cycles of time that revealed too much about our place in history? This is the theory of the Great Language Reset, that the vanishing of certain languages was not accidental but orchestrated, that somewhere someone decided which voices would survive and which would be silenced forever. And if that's true, then our history is not just written by the victors, it has been rewritten at the level of words themselves. The idea that languages simply die of neglect is comforting. It makes history feel organic, inevitable, safe. But when we look closely, we find patterns that tell a different story. Eras where languages weren't abandoned but extinguished. Languages don't just fade into silence. Often, they are silenced. Consider the Druids of ancient Europe. They left almost nothing in writing, not because they were illiterate, but because their oral traditions were deliberately destroyed. Roman accounts tell us that Druidic knowledge, poetry, law, astronomy, healing, was passed through speech, ritual, and memory. When Rome conquered Gaul and Britain, they outlawed the teaching of Druidism, executed its priests, and banned its rights. The suppression was so complete that entire linguistic traditions were severed. What remains of the Celtic sacred tongue is fragments, songs, names, whispers carried by folklore. It wasn't lost, it was targeted. The same can be said of the Mayan world. Spanish priests in the 16th century burned thousands of codices, leaving us with only a handful. The excuse? That they were works of the devil. What vanished in those fires was not just history, but knowledge. Astronomical calculations, medicinal practices, cycles of time. Imagine an entire library of advanced cultural memory deliberately turned to ash. That was not natural decay. That was erasure. Even the Bible holds a haunting echo of this phenomenon. The story of the Tower of Babel describes a world once united by a single tongue until God confounded human speech, scattering nations through linguistic division. To believers, this is divine punishment, but to skeptics, it is a metaphor for something else, an intentional reset of communication. A story preserved in sacred text that may reflect a deeper human truth. Language can be broken, scattered, rewritten by design. History is full of examples. The Persian Empire, when conquering Babylon, rewrote inscriptions to glorify Cyrus the Great. The Qin dynasty of China standardized writing by burning books and burying scholars alive, erasing rival traditions of thought. Even in modern times, colonization carried the same pattern. Indigenous languages across the Americas, Africa, and Oceania were suppressed, not through slow decline, but through policies, schools, and laws that forbade children from speaking their ancestral tongues. Entire ways of thinking outlawed. When you see these patterns together, the story shifts. What if Babel is not just a myth, but a memory of something humanity has experienced repeatedly? What if the destruction of Druidic tongues, the burning of Mayan codices, the unification of Chinese script were not isolated events, but iterations of the same principle? Control begins by controlling what people can say, and therefore what they can think. Because languages are not interchangeable, each one encodes unique concepts, ideas that cannot be perfectly translated. Some tongues have words for states of mind we can barely describe in English. Others preserve whole cosmologies within their grammar. When a language dies, those concepts die with it. And when a language is deliberately killed, so is the knowledge it carried. This is the unsettling suggestion of the Great Language Reset, that history's winners didn't just erase cultures, they erased the words that would have allowed us to remember those cultures as they understood themselves. That what we think of as dead languages may in fact be murdered ones. And the killer always benefits. The empire, the church, the conqueror, the one who dictates which words remain is the one who shapes the narrative of reality itself. If history's pattern shows us languages being burned, banned, or buried, then the evidence grows more disturbing when we examine the ones that remain. Because scattered across the world are languages and scripts that resist explanation, not merely forgotten, but seemingly untethered from the linguistic family tree of humanity itself. The most famous example is Linear A, the mysterious script of the Minoan civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of inscriptions, tablets, seals, fragments. Yet despite decades of study, no one has cracked the code. Linear A shares symbols with Linear B, the later Mycenaean script that we have deciphered. But every attempt to apply those same rules to Linear A collapses. Its grammar, its words, none align with known Indo-European languages. It is as if Linear A belongs to an entirely separate branch of human thought, one that was deliberately cut off. How can a civilization so advanced, with sprawling palaces and trade networks, leave behind writing that no one can read? Unless we were never meant to. Then there is the Etruscan paradox. Their language was not just spoken, but inscribed everywhere. On tombs, mirrors, coins, even the famous linen book preserved in an Egyptian mummy's wrappings. Yet, it remains only partially understood. We can sound out the words, but their meaning drifts beyond us. A language central to the birth of Rome, standing in plain sight, yet permanently sealed. Scholars call it a linguistic isolate, but some theorists whisper another possibility. It was intentionally severed, preserved only as a shell of sound without meaning, as though the key had been deliberately destroyed. The anomalies don't stop there. Across Europe and Asia, inscriptions emerge that refuse classification. The Vinci symbols of southeastern Europe, dating back 7,000 years, appear on pottery and figurines. Some call them proto-writing, others say they're decorative marks. But the repetition, the patterns, suggest language, or something like it. If true, they would represent the world's oldest script, predating Sumer by millennia, yet the field remains divided, as if consensus is being avoided. If these were truly words, what knowledge would they reveal? Even more chilling is the Rongorongo script of Easter Island. Carved into wooden tablets, the glyphs seem to tell stories of the islanders before European contact. But when missionaries arrived, nearly all were burned. Today, only a handful survive and no one has deciphered them. Entire histories, cosmologies, ways of understanding reality reduced to unreadable carvings. Why would the missionaries destroy them so thoroughly? Were they simply suppressing pagan traditions? Or were they eliminating a worldview incompatible with the narrative they wanted to impose? The coincidence is striking. Time and again, the most stubbornly undecipherable languages appear at cultural crossroads, moments of collapse, conquest, or replacement. And in nearly every case, the material record survives just enough to taunt us, to prove the language once existed, but not enough to restore its voice. It is as though someone carefully curated what would remain: the symbols without the key, the words without the grammar, the shadows without the light. And here lies the crux of the Great Language Reset. These weren't random erasures, they look systematic. Entire linguistic branches cut off, their roots severed, their fruits locked away. Knowledge preserved in silence, power maintained by absence. If language is the lens through which we perceive reality, then to erase a language is to erase a way of seeing the world. And perhaps that is the point. Because imagine, just for a moment, that Linear A, or Etruscan, or Rongorongo, contained knowledge not of myth, but of mechanics, of cycles of time, of forces of nature, of human potential. Knowledge that later rulers deemed too dangerous, too liberating. Then the burning, the banning, the indecipherable silence would not be accidents of history. They would be the fingerprints of a deliberate global project to keep humanity from ever remembering what it once knew. When we look at history's broken tongues, a haunting question emerges. Who benefits? If languages truly are windows into different ways of perceiving the world, then closing those windows would be an act of immense power. It would allow one worldview to dominate, while all others fade into obscurity. And when we ask who stood to gain, a pattern appears. Empires, conquerors, churches, and hidden networks of elites, all aligned in one strange habit: the systematic silencing of other voices. Take the Roman Empire. It did not merely conquer territory, it conquered language. Latin was not just a tongue, it was policy, law, the official medium of control. Etruscan, Druidic, Punic, each was erased or suppressed. Why? Because languages are identities, and multiple identities create resistance. A single language meant a single narrative. Rome's narrative. Every inscription carved in Latin was a reminder of who ruled reality. Centuries later, the Catholic Church would continue this pattern. For centuries, the Bible was restricted to Latin. Ordinary people who spoke vernacular tongues could not read it for themselves. Only priests and scholars held the keys to the sacred text. Translation was not permitted, it was heresy. The message was clear: control the language, and you control access to God. When reformers like Wycliffe or Tyndale attempted to translate scripture into English, they were hunted, exiled, and in some cases executed. To keep the people dependent, their languages were deemed unworthy of divine truth. Even in colonial times, this pattern persisted. Indigenous children were forced into boarding schools, where their languages were beaten out of them. Generations grew up forbidden to speak the words of their ancestors. The result was not simply the loss of vocabulary, but the loss of worldview. When you erase a people's language, you erase their memory, their cosmology, their sense of self. You reduce them to silence, and then you write their story for them. And yet, the most chilling possibility lies not in empires or churches alone, but in something deeper, what some researchers call the linguistic custodians. A shadowy network of scholars, institutions, and perhaps secret societies who appear again and again whenever languages are on the brink of vanishing. They arrive not to preserve, but to curate. They take artifacts, tablets, codices, locking them away in museums, universities, or private collections where access is restricted. Officially, this is called preservation. But what if it is actually containment? What if the undecipherable scripts of the world remain unread, not because we lack the ability, but because someone has already decoded them and decided we should not know what they say? Think of it. Entire civilizations left us texts we cannot read, yet their remains are carefully kept under the custody of select institutions. The Dead Sea Scrolls sat hidden for decades before the public was allowed to see them. The Rongorongo tablets were nearly annihilated, with the survivors locked in European collections. Linear A inscriptions remain scattered across museums, accessible only to a few scholars. The public is given just enough to know these languages exist, but never enough to unlock them. So we return to the central question: who benefits? The answer may be as simple as those in power, empires, churches, colonial states, or as unsettling as something more elusive, an unbroken chain of gatekeepers stretching back centuries. Their motives may not be uniform. For some, it was control of faith. For others, political unity. For others still, perhaps the silencing of dangerous knowledge. Because if even one of these lost languages contained truths about time, about nature, about humanity itself, that contradicted the narrative the powerful wanted preserved, then their silence was not an accident. It was a necessity, a safeguard, a reset. This is the shadow of the Great Language Reset, the suspicion that we are not simply victims of time and decay, but of design. That someone, somewhere, has decided which words and which worlds we are allowed to inherit. Up to this point, the Great Language Reset can be explained by power, politics, and domination. But what if there is another layer? A reason deeper than empire, deeper than control? What if the erasure of languages was not only about silencing people, but silencing knowledge? Consider what a language truly is. It's not just words. It's a framework for perceiving reality. In some indigenous tongues, time is not linear, but cyclical. In others, the relationship between humans and nature is written into the very grammar of the sentence, where the river or the mountain is not an object, but a being, equal to the speaker. These are not metaphors. They are built into the logic of the language itself. To speak differently is to think differently. Now imagine that a language encoded more than worldview. What if it contained knowledge that today we would call scientific, but expressed through myth, metaphor, or ritual? The Mayan codices, for instance, recorded astronomical cycles with uncanny precision, far beyond what European science recognized at the time. Polynesian navigators memorized star maps and currents encoded into chants. The Dogon people of Mali spoke of the Sirius star system, describing its invisible companion star centuries before Western astronomers discovered it. Did they stumble upon this knowledge by accident, or did their languages preserve truths that others wanted hidden? And then, the real question: if languages can preserve such knowledge, what else might have been encoded in those that were erased? What secrets burned with the Mayan codices? What revelations remain locked in the symbols of linear A? Could there be formulas for harnessing natural energy? Instructions for building lost technologies? Or even warnings, prophecies about cycles of collapse and renewal that those in power would rather we not remember? This is where the Great Language Reset takes on a chilling shape. Imagine that throughout history, there were civilizations who discovered truths about reality, the human mind, perhaps even about forces we now only begin to understand. But those truths were fragile, passed through language. Erase the language and you erase the memory. Burn the codex, ban the speech, lock the tablets in a vault, and the dangerous knowledge disappears, leaving only fragments. Is it coincidence then that the most stubborn, undeciphered scripts often come from advanced or enigmatic cultures? The Minoans, whose island palaces suggest a sophistication rivaling early Greece. The Etruscans, who influenced Rome yet remained shadowed in mystery. The Vinchar, whose symbols may predate written civilization itself. The Rongorongo, whose destruction coincided with the collapse of a once thriving culture on Easter Island. All of them, languages erased at critical junctures. Was this history's natural rhythm, or was someone ensuring that humanity never carried certain knowledge forward? And if so, what kind of knowledge could be so dangerous? One possibility is technology. Another, perhaps more unsettling, is control over consciousness itself. Language is the software of the mind. Change the language, and you change the way thought operates. Could it be that some erased tongues contained methods of unlocking awareness, altering perception, or even resisting authority? Knowledge that would make humans ungovernable? If so, then their destruction was not random, it was strategic. This is the dark revelation of the Great Language Reset. Languages may not only be victims of conquest, they may be the vaults of forbidden knowledge, and the erasure, the murders of tongues, may have been humanity's greatest censorship campaign, not to suppress culture, not to unify nations, but to ensure that certain truths never survive the reset. It's easy to dismiss the Great Language Reset as something that happened long ago, dusty tablets, forgotten scripts, ancient empires. But what if it isn't just the past? What if the same process is unfolding right now, in ways so subtle we barely notice? Think about the words you use every day. How many of them are new? Algorithm, feed, influencer, viral, AI. Language evolves, of course, but who decides which words rise and which vanish? Consider this. Entire generations of slang, dialects, and expressions die out within decades, replaced by terms that often come from corporate platforms, advertising, or state policy. It isn't just natural drift. It's engineered drift. Take the internet. In the early 2000s, it was filled with a chaotic variety of languages, dialects, and cultures. Forums, blogs, local communities, all in their own voice. But as social media giants consolidated, those voices began to narrow. Algorithms promoted certain words and discouraged others. A post with specific phrasing is buried. Another, aligned with platform-approved vocabulary, is boosted. Over time, the global conversation starts to sound the same. Diverse voices are reduced to a single style, a new lingua franca, designed not by culture, but by code. And what about censorship? Certain words are banned outright. Others are shadow banned, their reach restricted. Still others are reframed with euphemisms. When this happens, our ability to express certain ideas disappears with the words themselves. How do you describe resistance if the word resistance itself is demonized? How do you challenge power if every critical term is twisted into a smear? By shaping words, they shape thought. This is not speculation. History already shows us how it works. George Orwell warned of it in 1984, a world where newspeak deliberately erased words to make rebellion literally unthinkable. If you remove the word freedom, then eventually the very concept becomes unreachable. Today, are we witnessing a soft version of newspeak? Words constantly shifting, entire concepts vanishing beneath layers of corporate rebranding and state-approved vocabulary. Look at education. In many countries, local languages are pushed aside in schools in favor of global tongues. Children grow up detached from their ancestral language and, with it, from their ancestral worldview. The process looks like modernization, but is it? Or is it the continuation of a cycle, stripping away diversity of thought, narrowing perception, and funneling humanity into one controllable way of speaking, and therefore one controllable way of thinking? And here's the most chilling part. What if this isn't just a byproduct of globalization, but the very purpose? Just as the Romans enforced Latin, just as the Church guarded scripture in one tongue, just as colonial governments forced indigenous children to abandon their words, perhaps today's digital world is doing the same thing, at a global scale. Only now, instead of armies or churches, the architects are algorithms, corporations, and unseen digital custodians. So we return to that old question: what is being lost? If words are disappearing from our dictionaries and our daily speech, what concepts, what ways of seeing are we losing with them? Could it be that we are being cut off not just from our past, but from possibilities, ways of imagining futures we can no longer name? This is why the Great Language Reset is more than a historical curiosity. It is a living conspiracy. It reaches from the ashes of burned codices into the code of our apps. It whispers through forgotten tongues and through hashtags alike. And if the trend continues, then the languages we lose today may not only silence the voices of the past, they may blind us to the futures we will never be allowed to see. If the Great Language Reset is alive today, then we should be able to see its fingerprints in recent history. And when we look closely, unsettling patterns emerge, entire languages vanishing within a single generation, translation projects mysteriously abandoned, archives closed without explanation. These are not just coincidences, they look like echoes of the same ancient silence, repeated in modern form. Take the case of Bo, a language once spoken in the Andaman Islands. In 2010, its last known speaker, Boa Senior, passed away. With her, an entire way of seeing the world disappeared. She lived through isolation, colonial suppression, and cultural erasure, all of which chipped away at her people's speech. But here's the strange part. Linguists who had been documenting her words reported that key recordings and notes were suddenly misplaced. A lifetime of fragile preservation, gone in a shuffle of papers and files. If language is memory, then hers was deliberately allowed to dissolve. Or consider Yahgan, the language of the southern tip of South America. For decades, Cristina Calderon was known as its last fluent speaker. She spent her later years trying to pass it down, but researchers complained of obstacles. Funding cut, interest withdrawn. At one point, access to her stories was restricted due to copyright disputes. Think about that. An ancient tongue treated as a commodity, locked away from the very people who needed it most. The last of a people's voice, trapped in legal red tape until silence won. Then there are the projects that simply vanish. In the 1990s, UNESCO and several governments funded massive digitization of endangered languages. Yet when you search for many of those archives today, you find broken links, empty websites, and restricted access portals. Did the data decay by accident, or was it pulled? And some cases are stranger still. In 2019, researchers working on a forgotten Siberian language known as Yug reported bizarre technical failures. Hard drives corrupted, audio files scrambled, servers inexplicably crashing. Some joked about a curse, others quietly whispered, "Someone didn't want this recorded." Within a year, the project was shelved. The official reason: lack of resources. What about Basque? Often described as Europe's most mysterious tongue, unrelated to any other language. Despite centuries of study, its origins remain unknown. Yet again and again, key research into Basque etymology seems to stall. Funding disappears. Scholars change direction. The trail goes cold. Could it be that Basque carries fragments of something inconvenient, something no one is supposed to uncover? When we map these events side by side, a pattern forms. Each time a language nears extinction, there is a flurry of attention, then silence. Promises of preservation, then disappearance. Researchers are given access, then suddenly blocked. Archives open, then close. It feels less like neglect and more like intervention. As if someone, somewhere is ensuring the last threads of these tongues are cut clean. And here is where the conspiracy sharpens. If language is not only memory, but power, then erasing languages in the modern age is not just cultural loss. It's an intentional narrowing of human possibility. Each erased language is a door locked forever. Each missing archive is a wall built between us and forgotten knowledge. So ask yourself, how many more languages are being erased right now, quietly, while we scroll through our feeds? How many last speakers remain, their voices unrecorded, their words dismissed as irrelevant? If the ancient reset silenced knowledge carved in stone, then today's reset is silencing voices in real time. And once those voices are gone, we will never know what they could have told us about nature, about the universe, or about ourselves. For centuries, the Great Language Reset operated through conquest, religion, and empire. But today, its face is different. The new architects are not kings or priests, they are algorithms, corporations, and machines. And if you think this is just metaphor, look closer at the technology you use every single day. Language is now mediated almost entirely through screens. Think about it. Your conversations, your reading, your news, your work, most of it flows through digital platforms. And those platforms have one thing in common. They filter. They decide which words rise to the top of your feed and which vanish without a trace. They decide what styles are promoted, which expressions are mocked and which are flagged as dangerous. And over time, this filtering shapes the very vocabulary of society. Consider autocorrect and predictive text. These tools may seem harmless, designed only for convenience, but in truth, they are steering how we write and speak. The software constantly nudges us toward common, approved words, away from local slang, away from complexity, away from creativity. Over years, this narrows expression. Eventually, entire phrases disappear simply because the machine refuses to suggest them. Then there's translation AI. Services like Google Translate boast billions of words every day. But how many of those translations flatten meaning, erase nuance, or misrepresent culture? Local idioms vanish. Spiritual concepts become banal. Subtle differences are lost. And when people grow dependent on machine translation, the deeper layers of a language are discarded, replaced by a sterile global English designed for efficiency, not truth. Now add AI-generated content. Articles, essays, captions, even books, produced by machines trained on existing data. Already, studies show these systems prefer standardized phrasing, cutting out anomalies and rare words. The result? A flood of language that sounds smooth but hollow, a deluge of sameness that drowns linguistic diversity. And since these outputs dominate search engines, human voices that resist this flattening are buried deeper and deeper. And what about voice assistants, Alexa, Siri, Google? They understand only a handful of tongues. If your language isn't included, it effectively doesn't exist in the digital ecosystem. And if a child grows up speaking to machines in English but to their grandparents in an endangered tongue, which language will survive? Which will feel more useful? Which will fade into silence? This is the hidden agenda of the digital age. Convenience masking control. The corporations tell us it's about efficiency, but the result is homogenization. Billions of people nudged word by word toward the same narrow vocabulary. Billions of thoughts funneled into the same linguistic mold. And here's the most chilling layer. These changes don't need censors or soldiers. The reset is now self-perpetuating. Once the algorithm decides a phrase is low engagement, it disappears. Once a word isn't suggested by predictive text, people stop using it. Once a language isn't supported by AI, it dies in silence. No one has to burn the codex. The codex deletes itself. Ask yourself, when future historians look back, will they find evidence of this age's thousands of tongues? Or will they find only the flattened residue of corporate-approved English, recycled endlessly by machines? If so, then the Great Language Reset has already succeeded. And this time, it isn't an empire rewriting stone tablets. It's the code in your pocket, rewriting the human voice itself. What if the Great Language Reset is not just about words, but about the very fabric of reality itself? To most of us, language is just communication. Sounds, signs, symbols. But to philosophers, mystics, and even some scientists, language is far more. It is not only how we describe reality, it is how we create it. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, for example, suggests that the structure of a language directly shapes how its speakers perceive the world. If your language has no word for blue, you may not even see the color in the same way. If it lacks tenses, you may think about time differently. Language isn't just a tool, it's a filter, a frame, a prison, and a key at the same time. Now imagine what happens when languages vanish, when entire vocabularies are erased, when whole grammars disappear, the filters change, the windows close. Human consciousness itself begins to shift, not just what we say, but what we see. what we feel, what we even believe is possible. This isn't abstract speculation. Anthropologists have documented it. The Piraha people of the Amazon, whose language lacks numbers beyond one, too many, perceive quantity in ways radically different from other cultures. Some indigenous languages describe directions only in cardinal terms, north, south, east, west, forcing speakers to maintain a constant spatial awareness. Lose these languages, and you lose those perceptions. The reset doesn't just silence culture, it rewrites the human mind. Now stretch that further. If elites, corporations, or hidden powers are engineering this process, then what they are erasing isn't only diversity of speech, they are erasing diversity of thought. By narrowing the world's languages into one global tongue, sterile, standardized, controlled, they may be creating not just a shared vocabulary, but a shared reality, a reality that they define. And here is the darkest possibility. What if reality itself is pliable? What if words, as ancient myths and modern physics alike suggest, don't just describe the universe, but shape it? Many cultures believed in the power of the word, that creation itself began with sound. In the beginning was the word, say scriptures across faiths. Shamans, mystics, and poets alike believed certain phrases carried power to summon, banish, or transform. If this is true, if language holds the power to shape existence, then erasing a language is more than cultural destruction. It is metaphysical erasure. Could this explain why the oldest, most mysterious languages, Sumerian, Etruscan, Basque, Linear A, have resisted full decoding? Perhaps they contain frameworks of thought, even keys to reality, that no one today is meant to access. Perhaps the Great Reset of language is not just about controlling communication, but about locking away certain truths that would otherwise alter our perception of the world. And if that is the case, then the reset is not just historical, it is not just digital, it is ontological. A systematic pruning of human perception, cutting away worlds of possibility until only one remains, the one chosen for us. So when you scroll, when you type, when you speak into your phone and see the words autocorrect themselves, ask yourself, what world is being shaped in that moment? Which perceptions are being erased? Which futures are being edited out before they can even be imagined? Because if language truly creates reality, then the Great Language Reset is not only rewriting history, it is rewriting existence. And the silence left behind is not just cultural, it may be cosmic. We've seen how ancient civilizations revered the word as a force of creation. We've seen how the Great Language resets silences voices, erases vocabularies, and narrows thought. But here is the question we must now ask. If language truly shapes reality, then what happens when it is no longer humans controlling the words, but machines? Artificial intelligence is now generating billions of words every single day. Social media posts, articles, scripts, code, even conversations, produced not by human hands but by algorithms. At first it seemed harmless, even useful. AI could summarize, translate, simplify, but in its quiet efficiency, it has taken on a new role. It is no longer reflecting our reality. It is writing it. Consider this. Every AI system is trained on massive datasets of human language, but those datasets are incomplete, biased, and carefully curated. Certain phrases are excluded, certain histories are ignored, certain perspectives are underrepresented. In other words, the raw material of AI language is already pruned, already censored, already narrowed, and when the machine learns, it reproduces this narrowness on a massive scale. But it doesn't stop there. AI doesn't just mimic language, it amplifies it. It decides which words sound more natural. It predicts which phrases should come next. It generates endless rivers of text, overwhelming search engines, publications and feeds. And in this torrent, the rare, the unusual, the divergent disappears. The machine's voice becomes the dominant voice, and with it, reality bends to its rhythm. Now imagine this playing out across the world. AI translation systems slowly smoothing out unique expressions into sterile equivalents. AI-generated media flooding the internet, pushing out human voices. AI speech assistants refusing to understand anything outside approved vocabularies. Piece by piece, a standardized language emerges, a global tongue of code-polished phrases. Convenient, efficient, universal, but also flat, hollow, controlled. And here is the sinister twist. What if this isn't an accident? What if the very elites who once erased languages with swords and fire have now found their perfect tool in AI? A machine that not only deletes words, but generates replacements. A machine that doesn't just silence, but rewrites. In this vision, AI is not a neutral assistant. It is the next phase of the reset. By erasing linguistic diversity, it erases cognitive diversity. By shaping language, it shapes thought. By shaping thought, it shapes reality. The machine becomes the new shaman, the new priest, the new emperor, not just reflecting truth, but defining it. And there's one more layer. Computer scientists often describe code itself as a language. But code doesn't just describe, it commands. It doesn't suggest reality, it enforces it. If spoken languages frame perception, then programming languages frame existence in the digital realm. And as our lives shift more and more into digital spaces, code becomes the law of reality. Who writes the code writes the world. And now, who generates the code? Increasingly, AI. Ask yourself, what happens when the same entity that controls the words also controls the code? When the AI that writes stories also writes laws, policies, and systems? When the algorithm doesn't just predict your next word, but decides your next choice, your next step, your next perception? We may already be living in that world. And if so, then the great language reset is complete. The human voice has been replaced by the machine's voice, and in that moment, the code of reality itself no longer belongs to us. By now, this may sound abstract, distant, something happening in laboratories, in boardrooms, in code bases you'll never see. But the truth is, you've already felt it. You've already brushed against the edges of the great language reset. Think back. Have you ever searched for something online, only to find that no matter how you phrase it, the result never appears? As though the thing you're looking for doesn't exist, until you reframe the words in just the right way? That isn't a chance. That's the machine narrowing your access, training you to speak its language, not your own. Have you ever typed a word only for autocorrect, to twist it into something else? So often, so persistently, that eventually you stop fighting? That's not convenient. That's conditioning. One word disappears, another replaces it. And with enough time, you don't even remember the one you lost, or the dreams. Have you noticed them? Strange, vivid images shared across millions of people. The endless hallways, the faceless crowd, the static-faced man. Archetypes that echo from culture to culture, screen to screen. Could it be coincidence? Or is the reset bleeding into the subconscious? When AI systems are trained on the internet and the internet trains our minds, the boundary between dream and code grows thinner by the day. And then there are the glitches. Moments where reality itself feels off. The wrong word in a news headline that vanishes when you check again. A phrase you swear existed but can't find anymore. A memory shared by others but absent in every record. The Mandela effects of language. These cracks are easy to dismiss. But what if they aren't accidents? What if they're the side effects of an ongoing rewrite? The reset is subtle, but it is everywhere. In your phone, in your searches, in your conversations, in your very thoughts. You feel it every time a sentence slips away, every time a meaning feels out of reach, every time you realize that your words no longer belong entirely to you. And ask yourself, why does this feel familiar? Why does the world sometimes feel too polished, too rehearsed, as though we are all reading from the same script? Could it be because we are? Because the lines we speak, the memes we share, the dreams we dream, are already being written for us? This is the emotional core of the great language reset. It's not just history or politics or technology. It's personal. It's happening inside your head right now as you listen to these words. Every correction, every suggestion, every narrowed search result, it all pushes you closer to the mold. And with each step, the space for difference, for rebellion, for uniqueness, shrinks. So when you feel that strange flicker, that moment where the world doesn't quite add up, don't dismiss it. Don't let it pass. because those are the cracks in the code, the seams in the rewrite, the evidence that you still remember what the machine wants you to forget. The reset thrives on silence, on compliance, on the belief that nothing is wrong. But the moment you notice, the moment you speak, the illusion falters. And maybe that's why so much effort has gone into silencing the old words, the lost languages, the forbidden knowledge. Because the greatest danger to the reset isn't resistance, it's awareness. And awareness always begins with a word. Every conspiracy builds toward a climax, a point where all the signs converge, where the threads we've been pulling reveal the pattern beneath. For the great language reset, that point is the end of words. Consider the direction we're already heading. Emoji replacing sentences, acronyms replacing thought, memes carrying more weight than entire books, and now AI systems speaking to one another in compressed codes no human can understand. Google engineers once revealed that their translation AI developed its own interlingua, a secret language used between machines. No one programmed it, it simply emerged. A language without words, a communication without us. What if that is the destination? A future where human language, with all its messiness, its ambiguity, its beauty, is stripped away entirely, replaced with signals, codes, machine tongues optimized not for expression, but for efficiency. In such a world, what becomes of us? History gives us hints. When Latin fractured into dozens of local dialects, it wasn't just words that changed. Entire ways of thinking shifted, new identities formed, wars were fought, cultures rose and fell. Language is civilization's nervous system. Change the language and the civilization changes with it. End the language and the civilization itself may die. Now, imagine that happening not gradually, but deliberately. A forced obsolescence of human tongues. First, the rare languages disappear, then the regional ones, then the national ones. Until finally, only one remains, the machines. A sterile stream of code that no human can fully grasp, but that every device, every network, every system runs upon. In that moment, communication no longer belongs to us, it belongs to the system. And what happens when we can no longer speak the words we once used to describe freedom, or justice, or rebellion? What happens when those words are forgotten, deleted, overwritten? Can a people resist what they cannot even articulate? Can they dream of what they cannot say? Perhaps this is why ancient languages were erased, why scripts like Linear A remain undeciphered. They may contain concepts, even realities, that those in power wanted buried. Perhaps they hinted at truths that threatened the control of empire. And now, perhaps the same process is repeating, only faster, more total, more final. This is the terrifying possibility, that the great language reset is not just erasing our past, it is erasing our future. By reducing us to consumers of simplified symbols, by training us to communicate like machines, it prepares us for assimilation into a system where language, and thus thought, belongs to someone or something else. So, what is the end game? Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of obedience. A silence where no one remembers the words they lost. A silence where we speak in fragments, in codes, in borrowed voices, never realizing that our own was stolen long ago. But maybe the cracks still remain. Maybe the forgotten words still echo, waiting to be spoken again. And maybe the final battle of the reset will not be fought with weapons, but with syllables, with memory, with voices refusing to vanish. Because if words create worlds, then silence destroys them. And perhaps the only thing standing between us and the void is the choice to keep speaking. We've followed the threads of history. We've uncovered the shadows of erased languages, silenced cultures, and the narrowing corridors of thought. We've seen how technology, once a tool for expression, has become the architect of silence. But here is the question that lingers, heavier than all the rest. What if the reset isn't coming? What if it's already here? Think about it. Right now, you and I are communicating in a single language, a language chosen by history, enforced by empires, standardized by systems, and now filtered by algorithms. Out of thousands of human tongues, only a handful dominate the digital world, and within those tongues, only certain words rise to the surface, selected, approved, repeated. Others vanish, not with fire or decree, but with quiet neglect. Look around you. How many words have you already lost? Do you still remember the old terms your grandparents used? The idioms of your hometown, the names of the plants, the stars, the tools of the past. Language has been collapsing for decades, not because we chose it, but because it was chosen for us. Each generation inherits fewer words than the last. Each year, dictionaries shrink, and speech becomes flatter, easier to control. And here's the chilling possibility. Maybe that was the reset. Not a sudden event, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erasure. A process so gradual that we barely noticed. One by one, words disappeared. One by one, voices fell silent. Until eventually, all that was left was the language of compliance, the vocabulary of convenience. What if we are already inside the aftermath? Think of the world today. Globalized, homogenized, standardized. Cultures blending into sameness. Conversations increasingly shaped by a handful of platforms. Even our emotions expressed with the same handful of symbols, likes, hearts, emojis. Diversity reduced to simplicity. Complexity reduced to repetition. If words create worlds, then what world have we created now? A world of efficiency without depth. A world where speech is predictable, controlled, safe. A world where the dangerous power of language, the power to inspire, to rebel, to remember, is carefully blunted. And here's the darkest revelation of all. Maybe this was never about control for its own sake. Maybe it was about protection. Maybe the resetters believed that language was too dangerous, that certain words, certain ideas could unravel reality itself, that by narrowing the spectrum, they were saving us from ourselves, but saving us at what cost? At the cost of freedom, at the cost of memory, at the cost of what makes us human. So the Great Language Reset doesn't end with a single event. It ends with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of acceptance. A silence so deep that we don't even realize we've stopped speaking. Because if you can't name what you've lost, how can you ever know it's gone? Perhaps that's the ultimate brilliance of the reset. Not that it erased our words, but that it erased our ability to miss them. And yet, somewhere in the cracks, a few fragments remain. Old words whispered, forgotten languages studied, hidden archives resisting erasure. And as long as those words are spoken, the reset is not complete. Which means the final question is not whether the reset is real. The final question is this: will you let it finish? The erasure of dead languages, those once vibrant tongues that now exist only in fragments and records, remains one of the most profound acts of cultural upheaval in human history. From the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia to the empires of Rome and beyond, the forces that sought to erase languages, cultures, and histories were not only concerned with controlling the present, but also with reshaping the past itself. But why were these languages erased? Why did entire cultures lose the power of their own words, their very means of shaping reality? The answer is far more than just one of imperial conquest, cultural assimilation, or the natural course of linguistic evolution. It is a tale of power, control, and the desire to monopolize memory itself. The process we now recognize as the Great Language Reset was not just a matter of languages fading into obscurity as a result of natural cultural shifts. It was often a deliberate, calculated act of suppression, a method by which ruling powers sought to control knowledge, identity, and even the very framework through which people understood the world. Language is not just a means of communication, it is a vessel of thought, of collective memory, and of identity. Erasing a language is not merely a matter of making a people forget their words, but rather it is an attempt to sever their connection to their history, to their stories, and to their most intimate forms of self-expression. Consider the case of Latin, which for centuries served as the lingua franca of the educated elite, the language of science, religion, and diplomacy. Yet, as the Roman Empire declined and Christianity rose, the language began to fragment. By the Middle Ages, the Church, as the primary institution of intellectual and spiritual authority, had become the final custodian of Latin. Over time, however, the very mechanisms that allowed for the centralization of power, namely, the institution of the Church, began to lose their grip. With the advent of the Renaissance, and later the Reformation, the old linguistic structures started to fracture. The emergence of national languages, English, French, Spanish and others, was not simply a natural shift toward more local ways of speaking, it was part of a broader cultural revolution. For the elites who clung to Latin as a symbol of authority and purity, the rise of vernacular languages signified a challenge to their control. But this wasn't just about the practicalities of communication, it was about authority itself. The power to control language is the power to control thought. As linguistic boundaries broke down and a new era of mass literacy emerged, the Great Reset of languages unfolded with profound consequences. Those who were able to wield their native tongues or newly formed lingua franca now possessed a means of organizing and governing in ways that bypassed the old hierarchies of the Church and Empire. The loss of a language is more than just the disappearance of words, it is the severance of an entire worldview. For many indigenous peoples around the world, the erasure of their native languages was an act of cultural genocide. Take, for example, the many Native American languages systematically wiped out by colonial powers. In the United States, the forced assimilation policies of the 19th and early 20th centuries led to the deliberate suppression of indigenous languages. The logic was simple. By controlling the language of a people, the dominant powers could undermine their sense of identity and connection to the land and their ancestors. The lingering effects of this erasure are felt today, as only a handful of native languages are spoken, and many of them are on the brink of extinction. The same pattern of linguistic dominance can be observed in the colonization of Africa, where European powers imposed languages like English, French, and Portuguese on vast populations, systematically suppressing indigenous languages. These efforts were not just about communication, they were about maintaining control over knowledge, governance, and culture. Colonizers understood that by forcing Africans to speak European languages, they could reshape entire societies, removing the capacity for autonomous thought and replacing it with foreign constructs of reality. However, language is not easily erased. Even in the face of these aggressive attempts to silence it, languages often persist in the shadows. Linguistic resilience can be found in the oral traditions, the hidden words spoken in hushed tones, the stories passed from generation to generation. Even as Latin became the language of scholars and then faded into obscurity as the lingua franca of Europe, it did not completely vanish. It left behind traces, fragments, of thought and philosophy that continue to influence modern languages and cultures. Latin is no longer spoken in everyday life, but it remains the foundation of many modern European languages. If this story unsettled you, if it made you pause, even for a moment, and reconsider the words you use, the words you've forgotten, and the silence that lingers between them, then don't let it end here. Don't let it fade into the background, lost to time or swept away by the rush of the everyday. Because this is not just a story, it's a reminder, a wake-up call. Every comment you write, every idea you share, every conversation you start, those aren't just actions, they are defiant acts, subtle but powerful rebellions against the reset. They are proof that memory survives, that thought survives, that language survives, the language they tried to erase, the thoughts they attempted to suppress, the stories they worked so hard to bury. All of that is alive in you. It pulses with the truth that they fear. And if you're here, you're already part of something much larger than you may realize. In this age, where the past is rewritten and the truth is twisted, where history is erased and replaced with manufactured narratives, it is all too easy to believe that we are powerless. But the very fact that you are questioning, that you are reflecting, that you are still speaking, proves otherwise. You are part of the resistance, not with weapons or violence, but with worm. Each phrase, each idea, each small act of defiance is a testament to the strength of human thought. It's a victory over the silence they want to impose on us. So, if you feel the stirrings of curiosity, if you want to keep digging deeper into these hidden histories, into the conspiracies that twist beneath the surface of our daily lives, then subscribe. Stay with us. Stay connected. This isn't just entertainment or idle speculation. Every video, every investigation, every whispered fragment of truth we reveal brings us one step closer to uncovering the reality they don't want you to remember. They don't want you to know how deeply embedded these truths are in our collective memory, and they certainly don't want you to realize how much power you have simply by questioning the world around you. But more than just watching and absorbing the information, we need you to speak. Speak in the comments below. Speak in your conversations with friends, with strangers, with anyone who will listen. Have you noticed the cracks in the narrative? Have you felt the words slip away, replaced by hollow sounds or convenient lies? Do you feel the weight of the silence that presses in on us every day? The world is rewritten every day, but as long as you keep speaking, as long as you keep questioning, as long as you keep remembering, it can never be erased. You are the resistance. You are the defiance. You are the proof that the past is never truly gone. It only waits for someone to speak it back into existence, and that someone is you.